Good evening, everybody, and welcome to NYC Film Green Office Hours. My name is Shira Gans, and I'm the Senior Executive Director of Policy and Programs, the New York City Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment, where I direct NYC Film Green, which is New York City's program to promote sustainable film production. The Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment is New York City's film commission, and we're also the city agency that supports all the creative sectors in New York. These creative sectors support 440,000 jobs and 150 billion in economic activity for the city. In this series, we delve into different topics relating to sustainable film production. And I'm really excited for tonight's conversation. Usually we're talking about technical ideas about how to make a film set more sustainable, looking at physical approaches and strategies for how to do that. Tonight, we're going to talk more about what makes a story a climate story and how do you tell that story? What frameworks and different mechanisms you need to employ to make that story impactful and really bring in the science and all the different components of climate in order to make it an effective story. And tonight we have three very exciting guests who are all really stars in their own right, but have come together to form an organization called Global Rise, Stories for the Future. So without further ado, I'm going to bring on Lydia Pilcher, Jesse Kite, and Abby Rabinowitz for tonight's edition of Film Green Office Hours. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
I think we still have that slide up. Nicole, are we done with our slide? Does that look normal to everyone? I don't know. There we are. I think that's what it looks like. Okay. Well, thank you guys for joining. I'm so excited for this conversation. I think it's really important, not only because it's so important for film and television, but I really think for anyone who cares about climate and how to engage folks and make that discussion more impactful, I think it's going to be a useful conversation. So first, please introduce yourselves. We have your bios in the chat. It would take the whole hour to talk about all of your accomplishments. So Lydia, why don't you kick it off?
Okay, thank you, Shira. I'm Lydia Pilcher. I'm a filmmaker based in New York. I have a production company, Cinemosaic, and I've worked here for over 2 decades as a member of several unions and guilds, and we work with the studios around sustainability. It's been mostly around production in the early years, and then since the pandemic, there's been a real shift to climate storytelling on screen. That has become a deep dive interest for me personally. I teach storytelling arts at the Columbia Climate School now, and also work with UN Climate Change with entertainment and culture for climate action, film and TV.
Amazing. Jesse.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Shira. My name is Jesse Kite. I am a writer, I'm a film scholar, I'm an international script and story consultant. I'm also the head of screenwriting and associate arts professor at NYU Tisch, where I teach climate storytelling. I got involved with climate storytelling probably about 4 years ago, which would have surprised my ninth grade science teacher, but I did. And I have since started to teach climate storytelling through Global Rise, but also I teach a class at NYU on climate storytelling, Sundance, the Torino Film Lab, the Venice Biennale. So just in a lot of different arenas, really thinking about climate storytelling in the expansive way in which we can tell new stories, really.
And Abby.
Thanks, Shira. Hi, everybody. I'm Abby Rabinowitz, and I'm a climate writer and professor. I started writing about climate change in 2016 when President Trump was elected the first time, and I wondered, what are we going to do? I've written about climate policy, climate media narratives. Most recently, I write about climate change and technology. And I direct the writing program at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering, where I also teach a climate storytelling class. In this case, I'm asking engineers to solve the really thorny problem of how we can climate storytell effectively, which is also what brought me together with Lydia and Jesse. And so happy to be here this evening.
This is so exciting. I just want to kind of reflect before we get into the questions that this conversation is reflecting not only an iconic New York industry, which is film and television, but all these amazing academic institutions and other, um, areas as well, like journalism. So that I think as we get into this more, this isn't just a siloed conversation. This is really drawing on not only New York institutions, but an interdisciplinary approach. So I guess the first question is, you guys obviously have a lot going on. It's not like you had just, oh, we have all this spare time. So what inspired you to start Global Rise, and what are the goals in doing so?
Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying that, as someone who is really working in Hollywood and independent film, I realized a few years ago that there was not a pipeline for climate storytellers in our industry. And it was around this time that in the pandemic, we had realized that there was a climate silence on our screens, and many people across the industry, many groups were trying to address this and figure out what we can do. And there were different climate storytelling trainings that were popping up from different groups, important groups like NRDC and Good Energy. And I was part of a WGA and PGA climate storytelling working group. And as we sort of worked through all of the things that were available to us, we realized that we just wanted to go deeper. We wanted to go below the surface and really look at what we understood at the time as a very complex issue, but it was how do we translate that into our storytelling on screen? And so I think, Shira, you hit it on the head when you said interdisciplinary, because that was when I, having taught cultural strategy at NYU, decided I would design a course that was interdisciplinary with a film school at Columbia and a climate school, and see what we could do by putting all of these brains together. And it's turned out to be an amazing experience. I'm going into my third year of teaching it. But when I was on that road, that journey to design the course, I met Jesse and I met Abby, two New Yorkers, and we're all in the same city, kind of interested in the same things, but coming at it from slightly different, angles and points of view. And so we teach in each other's classes. We talk about these issues all of the time, and we found ourselves innovating. And that was when we realized we should take it outside of the classroom. And that's, I'm going to Jesse, why don't you talk about some of the goals that we've found ourselves pursuing?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this has been exciting. I love the way Lydia kind of talked about it in terms of this organic process, because that's really how we've been from the inception. It's been very organic. We've sort of meet the moment that appears to us. So some of the goals that we are the cornerstone of what we do started as our site-specific multi-day workshops. And so these are deep dives, interdisciplinary deep dives into climate storytelling, and we do make them site-specific. So we had one in New York, was our first one. We did one in Los Angeles. And so with each location, we bring in local experts, but we also think about what are the concerns that are specific to that area. We're going to be going to Bangkok in the summer, for example. So that is sort of expanding those multi-day workshops is one of our goals. We also do these catalyzer events, which are partnerships where these are people come to us, and we've had the Human Impacts Institute come to us. We have the Climate Film Festival come to us. And these are institutions that really just want to take what we're doing and attach it to what their agenda is. So Human Impacts Institute, a lot of community organizers, and we create programming that's specific to their audience that pulls on our expertise as well. We also do extended development workshops. So we did one in the fall, which was a 6-week workshop for people who want to develop a climate script. So our goals are to keep moving in this direction and keep meeting the moment. Very open to partner organizations coming to us to say, hey, you do something that's really cool, and we think would really help us with what we're trying to do. So we keep expanding into new spaces based on those collaborations. But I mean, is it too much to say we want to change the world? I don't know. It's kind of a goal.
Great
Change the
goal.
world. Yeah.
Yeah, we do. And I really think that in all of these workshops, we're really thinking about not just like what's a product or story coming out of this, but how are we really working together? We really see, as you said, Shira, climate change is an interdisciplinary problem. And we need to solve it together across disciplines, cultures, and countries. And so in my own writing with scientists and engineers, I've really seen that I'm able to tell stories with so much more imagination and authority than I can on my own. And I think what really excites me about entering, which is for me a new discipline of film and TV, is really thinking about how collaborative those media are, how much they invite collaboration and cooperation. And I also think, scientists and researchers have a lot to learn from film and TV, and we're excited to explore expanding to researchers and scientists in the future. Specifically, I think oftentimes, storytelling is not like we all tell stories, but it's not necessarily innate. And I think it's so important that we really approach climate change not as this huge topic, which can just feel so vast and broad and incomprehensible. And really, I feel like film and TV have a lot to teach scientists and researchers about how to tell a story with tension, characters, and all of that. So that's also one of our goals, is to kind of spread the message beyond this media.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and that there can be a really compelling story that might miss that social impact,
Mm-hmm.
informative call to action. And then you can also have this inundation of technical information that can both be hard to parse and alienating. So the marriage of these things makes sense. So I guess maybe we could talk a little more about, you know, it sounds like you guys are really bringing in a new approach, which begs the question, why is a new approach needed? I think we've seen like, oh, look, people are driving EVs on screen, or that character likes to recycle, or they're not wearing, they like vintage clothing, so it's combating fast fashion. But it sounds like you guys are doing something a little more nuanced. So can you talk to me about what are the challenges and dynamics that exist in climate storytelling, and how is this kind of different from other storytelling?
Yeah, yeah. I think, oh, unplugged something. I think I really think about this question of like, what are we really talking about when we're talking about a climate story? My first year in college, we had this question like, what is art? And I feel like, I don't feel like I'm prepared to offer the definitive answer, but like sometimes what I think about is the question like, well, what is a love story? Is a story that simply mentions the existence of love, or like, we have a heist movie and we like zoom in on a close up of a Hallmark Valentine. No. And so I feel like similarly, a climate story, as you're saying, can't just be a shot of one person driving an EV, or someone recycling, or taking an independent action. And so like, to me, what we really are hoping for is a story that really asks us to deeply engage with the effects of climate change, fires and floods, but also its causes. And the causes uncomfortably, I think, are us. I mean, we are reshaping the planet with our actions and our values, power structures. And I don't think a single story can deal with this whole, like, I really think of it as mind blowing. Lydia and I have talked about hyper objects, like hyper object kind of reality alone. Any more than one story alone can deal with all aspects of love. But I do think a climate story should really ask us to engage meaningfully with some of it, with our hearts and imaginations. And so I really think we need to be expansive in how we're telling stories, which is something we talked about, Jesse.
And I also think, Abby,
Yeah,
I just want to tack on that I
please. Yeah.
think it's about, I think we often really talk about the future, which hence the name of our group,
Yeah.
right? Stories for the Future. I think we find that because it's overwhelming and because the concept can be abstract, even though it touches everything, that people often find themselves psychologically distanced from their
Yeah.
future. And so a lot of the work that we do, and I do with students at Columbia, is we sort of think about what year do we want to project to in the future? Is it so one year it was 2040, one year it was 2050? If you go too far out, you're kind of making it up, and we want to kind of think about what are actionable things we can be thinking about that would inspire people in their lifetime to make a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Jesse, you talk about narrative
Yeah,
and
I
structure.
mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's also one of those things in terms of thinking about the future. Sherry, I want to go back to something you'd said initially when you introduced the question. There is a place for talking about, yeah, there's an EV, or an e-bike, or someone's eating a vegetarian diet, and those are great modeling. But I feel like we're missing an opportunity to go much deeper and much more interesting places in terms of our climate storytelling. And just really quickly, I mean, in some of our work, we've identified sort of specific climate genres, and the one that people most think of is like apocalyptic and dystopic, and that tends to be a bit of a paralyzing genre to be showcasing as a climate story. It makes people feel very impotent and as though they can't do anything. It's a sort of fatalism, it's defeatism. And so thinking about sort of future storytelling, there's so many opportunities to think about, okay, so solar punk as a way of storytelling, thinking about activism, thinking about platform traditional ecological knowledge. There's just a lot deeper and more interesting ways to think about what is the future that we want to see. And I think that built into sort of the but part freighted with sort of the stories that we receive so often is this dominant narrative paradigm, which is very much perpetuating sort of the petroculture values of an extraction economy, a hero, and we're actually trying to expand the way we even think about stories so that we push beyond the received wisdom of what a story is and open up new ways of thinking about story to involve a different understanding of time, for example, or emphasizing collective protagonists as opposed to an individual protagonist. So really thinking deeply about what are our narrative structures, and how do we use those to expand the definition of a climate story. And I think that's something as well. Abby, you can talk to this too in terms of how we need to sort of the disinformation campaigns and how we sort of have to actually up our game in order to confront the disinformation campaigns that are quite active against us.
Wait, before you do that, Abby, I think I want to reflect on something that is interesting. Hearing you talk, the idea that a climate story is something maybe, that you're introducing an agenda, but actually in hearing you talk, which is resonating, is that there's actually already an agenda in some of these narratives. This sort of hero protagonist is an individualistic, non-collective
Yeah.
approach, and a lot of the happy endings involve a lot of material consumption, right? Like you're going to have a rom-com where you're going to land the like wealthy person and you're going to live in a fancy house and have a nice car. And so all these things actually have values and messaging that are already embedded about how we should be living our lives. It's like all the brands that you see. So this isn't actually something new. It's just sort of subverting it about what we should be having more at the center of the story.
Yeah, it's embedded and it's often unexamined. We
Yeah.
just receive it as, okay, that's how you tell a story, but we don't spend enough time sort of interrogating what are the values that are being implied by that way of telling a story. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Abby, sorry.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. And I'm just thinking so much of the dominant paradigms that we have is like very individualistic story, actually like a rom-com. And a lot of the actions that we see modeled on screen, which seem helpful, like maybe recycling or driving an EV, they're really through this lens of consumerism and individual action, which obscures the idea of climate as a really systemic problem. I think probably people here know that the term carbon footprint was coined by BP, in 2004. And so I think that we have kind of explicit climate denial, which our climate stories have to push back against, but we also have kind of a misframing of the problem in the first place, if that makes sense.
Because
Um,
the footprint's individual or
yeah, the idea that like climate action is individual action and that we act as consumers rather than voters, and that I mean, I don't think it has to be binary. Like, I think there's very useful, important things we can do as individuals, including telling these generative stories, actually. But that's not, what climate change is in some consumerism. I don't know. Does that make sense, Shira? Is that too?
it does make sense.
Yeah. Okay, good.
So I
Um,
guess, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit about like kind of the environment that our stories are operating in and some of the challenges given
Yeah.
disinformation. I don't know. I want to say too on the call, like I think, unfortunately, I think some of this might be familiar to many folks here, but there's a lot of headwinds when it comes to telling a climate story. We have the idea that climate change itself is fake news, to quote our current sitting president in the United States, but a long history of climate denial in the United States, maybe not as long as we think, but we have a fossil fuel lobby that perpetuated misinformation and disinformation around climate, using actually the same corrupt scientists that the tobacco industry did. So people might be familiar with merchants of doubt. I think more recently, we have the trope that climate change is happening, but it's not a big deal. And dealing with it would cause more economic harm than any benefits. We've even seen that from Bill Gates in 2000. Last fall, he wrote an essay kind of recanting the title of his book, which was just a few years earlier, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. AI is, I think, in the mix, both using energy and creating more disinformation. I'm saying like all the bad news. There's a lot of climate science. We were talking about how, traditional print media climate mentions are down 14% and 34% in network news. And finally, I think sometimes all of this gives me the feeling that it's too late to really do anything and we can't do anything about it. And I think that's also misinformation too, that we need to push back against, so we can imagine a future. Yeah, and Lydia, I think you had something we've been talking about the changing role of fossil fuels.
Yeah, but I
Yeah.
want to just to sort of pull up.
Oh, sure,
I'm going to
sure, sure.
pull up
Sorry, sorry. That was
pull
like
up
all my
my
bad
my
news.
my
You're
Right
side
away
of the
from
inside
the
my
flight
ledge.
lane.
brain.
Pull away from the
Um,
ledge.
I think
Yeah,
it's really important to acknowledge that the narrative has really been the narrative, the dominant narrative comes from an industry that doesn't really represent the narrative of what most people, in our country and
yes.
other places believe in. Most, Yale does these reports every year, and the percentages just go up, up, up. It's over 75%. It's going up toward 80% of people who are alarmed and concerned about climate change and want to see pro-climate policy.
Yeah.
But because of this narrative, we don't feel that we're that majority. We actually believe that the statistics are the opposite. And I think it's really important, and I message this all the time, is that we are a supermajority, and we need to really, everywhere we go, I mean, even on a film set, it's like let's raise our hand if we want to work together and do something. I tell you, every time I do it, someone in every department is, if not more, are raising their hands. And every union and guild in the film and television industry right now in Hollywood has a sustainability committee that is focused on what we can do. So I think it's important. I mean, we are under the thumb of that dominant narrative. And in fact, there was a new report that just came out from an advocacy group called Clean Creatives that the oil industry has systematically reshaped its advertising over the last 4 years. They're spending nearly $7 billion a year on media to promote the idea of the fact that fossil fuels are, it used to be that the promise of, a greener tomorrow was there. And I can tell you from going to the COP conferences in Azerbaijan, there was a little bit still of the fossil fuel companies who were there, saying that they were going to support a certain amount of renewable energy. That is no longer the case. And when we were in Brazil, 1 out of 60,000 people at the COP30 in Brazil, 1 out of 25 was a fossil fuel executive. And the gloves are really off. It's no longer, the core strategy of the fossil fuel industry to greenwash. It's about power and political influence. And now we're seeing it play out on a global stage with wartime strategy, completely. So I think we have to really take that narrative on. We have to really, we have to. The disinformation, there are a lot of groups now working on the disinformation, but I think that, looking at this advertising and the way that it's creating this petroculture, that's really what we're up against. It's not it's not that, that people aren't interested in it. I think they really do care, which is why it's interesting to really do what we do looking through the lens of popular culture, because that's where all the eyeballs are. And that's where, we see ourselves in terms of, where we are and where our imaginations might be able to take us.
And do you see those challenges? I mean, there might be a selection bias in that you're working with organizations or productions who want to tell these stories, but how does that disinformation or some of the politicalization, is that the way you say it, of this kind of science, how does that affect stories getting greenlit? We didn't talk about this too much, but as far as a challenge, like what do you see? Is there gatekeeping around getting these stories on screen? Is it easier on TV? Is it easier in a film? Thoughts on those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge. I think that, the studios are working, every studio is unique, has its own culture, it has its own unique approach to sustainability. So I think they're all approaching it differently. We've seen certain studios who have sort of stepped out in front and are working more aggressively on bringing stories that sort of show our human relationship to nature. Is it domination, or are we just part of it? Asking these kind of questions, which I think really stem from sort of more of the early days of environmental justice, which is now, with this power shift, has turned into more of a study of complex climate justice. But I think that in terms of our industry, it's harder here. I think that there are, I work quite a bit internationally, and there are more opportunities internationally to really work with storytellers who are, a little bit closer, to the edge, particularly in the global South. That's part of what ECA is doing with a program called Earth Witness. It's a, we have to sort of think about, all the myriad of ways that we can countermand this other structure, which is contributing to a global trend of authoritarianism. So we found in our teaching, that we have had to start talking about, climate and democracy together,
Yeah.
because that goes with freedom of speech, it goes with diversity of thought, it goes with, it's not, I don't think that anyone really, anymore is the feeling that the dominant conversation is whether climate change exists. I think we all understand that it exists. So it becomes more of a ideological, battle.
So we've outlined a lot of challenges, dynamics we're up against, geopolitical narratives, disinformation from very powerful entities, outdated storytelling structures, a sense of like powerlessness and impotence I heard.
Future
So,
thinking.
future thinking. Okay, so what are some of the strategies and frameworks that you use to increase the impact and dynamism of climate storytelling? Like what's going to help us here, please?
Yeah, I think one of the things, I mean, just going back to what you had said before, in terms of, well, how do you get a project greenlit? I do think, because you were also asking about TV versus film, we see in TV series, we see a little bit more of a friendlier attitude toward it than some of the tentpole films. Mainly because it allows you to look at climate storytelling in a couple different ways, and you can put it into a different storyline. Whereas their A storyline might be something else, your B storyline is something else, or it's something that arcs a couple episodes. So there is a way to bring climate storytelling and also to bring a more sort of nuanced perspective on it in TV. So I think that's how we're seeing that being expressed a lot, and also I work a lot internationally too, and we're seeing that happening more in some of the international programming. Film is still a bit trickier, which is unfortunate. And I must admit, I hear often in some of these panels, it's like, oh, make climate like it's the broccoli and the brownie, which I always find a little disappointing, because it's like, well, wait a minute, this is actually a missed opportunity to do something far more exciting than hide it in there as broccoli under a brownie. And so I think that if we can really think about how we embrace the opportunities to use the climate crisis as an opportunity to tell new stories and speak to a new audience. As Lydia was talking about, what is it? 7 out of 10 people want these stories,
Yeah.
and they just think that no one else wants them, but in fact they do. And so this is part of how you shift the needle. Is you, instead of just accepting received wisdom without examining it, actually challenge it a bit and write the material, make the material that you want to see out there. But I'm a bit of a rebel in the sense that I'm also kind of a fan of what I keep calling sort of grassroots distribution, where you like get it out and put it amongst your, get the local cafe to stream your film, that sort of thing. But in terms of thinking about how we can use these strategies and frameworks, world building is a big bit of it, a big piece of it. When you think about world building, the world you create is often the container for how your audience will understand and feel about the climate crisis. If you create a dystopian or a apocalyptic world, that's how your audience is going to feel. Whereas you could also create a story in which communities are adapting or problem solving, and so your audience is going to respond to the world you build through the world you build, quite literally. So what is possible versus what is impossible? What are the emotions that are invoked through your storytelling? How real does the crisis feel? How distant does it become? Whether you feel empowered or paralyzed is a big factor of your world building. And who lives there? Do you create a world in which your audience will actually see themselves on that screen? And that is really useful because, back to that stat that 7 out of 10 people want to see it, but I think only a third of that same portion feels that other people want to see it. there's a real sense of isolation. And so if you can use your storytelling and your world building to actually create characters on the screen that allow people to feel seen and feel heard and to recognize themselves, that also helps to offset that isolation and create a more powerful force of activists, even if it's just everyday activists. So, do we see ourselves and or what are the models of what we can be? How do you portray that on screen too?
Could you give an example of, sometimes it seems like some of the dystopian storylines both can be paralyzing, but they can be galvanizing because you feel kind of like, hello, can we wake up? Like, what's it going to take? And so what's a world in which the reality is stark and clear, but it's also empowering or allows people to access the crisis and not be paralyzed?
I mean, one of my favorite examples for that is actually Station 11, the TV series.
I couldn't even get past the first episode. I was so
Well,
tricked.
yeah, it's a tricky one. But well, that one's tricky because the pilot is actually nothing like the series. Like the pilot is not what the series is about. When you get into the series, it's really more about how do you create a new society in the wake of destruction. And so they're using arts, they're using culture, they're using community. And they also think a lot about in terms of cycles. They have this thing called the circle. And so they are trying to model new ways of being. And I think that's what part of what makes that successful as a model of a dystopic worldview and how do you rise above it. So I
Okay.
think that series is an example of that.
Note to self that someone who lived in through the pandemic in New York, I was like, oh my God, can't watch that, but I will skip that to the second episode.
Yeah.
Um, so Lydia, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the dynamics or kind of the systems thinking and how
Mm,
that is way?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll sort of add on to your question about these films that would help us see things differently. But yeah, when I began teaching at the climate school, I realized that all of the climate students were thinking in systems. And I realized that that wasn't what was happening with the conversation around storytelling in Hollywood and even independent film circles. And it gave me a lot of pause. And, we started to read the sort of key texts around sustainability and systems thinking. There's a author named Danilo Meadows who is not with us anymore, but she was a pioneer in sustainability. She wrote the seminal text. She was a co-author on Limits of Growth. And her work is quite interesting. And she talks about leverage points. And I started to sort of look at the different research that she puts forward. We also look at Frameworks Institute because they've done a lot of research around this as well. And interesting points began to come out. Like I'll just give you one, and then everybody can kind of Google and go look at this for yourself. But the idea that when you portray a character in a film or a TV show and you indicate the system that they are a part of, then you are no longer sort of putting that responsibility that Abby was talking about on the individual. You are able to sort of see the world of the character in the context of these systemic problems. And this has shown in research to create a strong empathy for the character and the world that they're in. And it also points a finger toward the problem and gives you an action point in terms of policy or any other way that you can sort of countermand where that's happening. I found that fascinating when I read that research, and it sort of sprung to us, in different ways around the systems thinking that were very and writers just loved it. They were like, oh my God, I mean, if I bring this in, then, what's happening, and we see it in the exercises and the workshops that we do, that it automatically adds more dramatic tension to the stories. It kind of ups the stakes of the conflict. It deepens your feeling for the characters at play. And if you're getting empathy out of it, then I think you're pretty close to a home run. So it's a very interesting framework to use. I think it's something that, given the world that we're living in right now and sort of the global interconnectedness of all things, the globalization, the systems. I mean, we've just learned, in this last year how every single country and place is, we're all connected in some way or another. And so that's one that we really like. One that I like to point to as a systems thinking movie, and nobody would have ever thought of it this way, I think, when the movie came out, is Black Panther. I think when you look at the world that Ryan Coogler created around Wakanda, I mean, it is what I call a protopia. It's a country that he created that wasn't born out of colonialism, and it's rich in biodiversity, and it's a highly technology advanced country. There's no cars. It's a vertical city, and all of these things that you think about how we may be living in the future in ways that sort of empower us toward a lifestyle that we can relate to. And I think Forbes did a article on the 5 transportation insights gleaned from Black Panther. And I think when you start to see articles like that, that creative minds are inspiring.
Yeah.
It seems that when we were talking earlier, I didn't know exactly what you were meaning by systems thinking. And so for some reason we were talking, one of my favorite shows came to mind, which is The Wire. And I think it does as someone who's been in public service my whole career, particularly at the municipal level, I think it's such a notable show because there's no bad characters. You really get into the world and the systems that drive either the drug trade if you're in poverty, or the pressures on press or politicians. And it's just so humanizing, and like organized labor and all these things. And so I think to take that to the climate, storytelling makes a lot of sense. So Abby, are there ways in which you have strategies for the science, or how do you take kind of what you do as a journalist and use that for on-screen storytelling?
Yeah, no, sure. As you were talking, I just started daydreaming about The Pit, which I also love, and I think really is also a story about systems. Have you been watching it?
Again,
And they have a hell of a heat wave and the air conditioning breaks down, but really the stories about, well, we have a broken system. We have a healthcare system that isn't working. We have a lot of ordinary heroism from doctors and nurses. And we also have a cast of characters taking action together, which, I mean, Jesse, I can speak more to this, but I think that is totally different than like the 3-act structure with like one protagonist. And I think when watching it helps the viewer really see the whole system, people acting within it. And to my mind, it creates a lot of empathy for some characters who I might not have empathy for ordinarily. I mean, I think, I really think in terms of what I bring from my background as a climate journalist or talking to scientists, I think one is one more depressing thing, but in grad school I learned bad for life, good for writing. So maybe this is good. Climate change is actually only one of the problems that we're facing. And I think, Lydia, you've been speaking to this too. Really, we're talking about a values crisis and a problem of power structures. I'm a really big fan of Naomi Klein and her book, Capitalism versus the Climate, really seeing climate as one symptom of like kind of extractive colonialism and late capitalism. So I think seeing it in those ways and knowing, therefore, that if you're covering democracy or working toward democracy, whether or not you ever say climate change, you're telling a climate story. I think that's really helpful. In terms of more bad news, like the idea that climate change is just one planetary boundary that we're in danger of passing, according to a Swedish scientist, Johan Rockström. He had a really great, I don't know if you saw, he had a really great documentary on the subject with David Attenborough in 2021 about planetary systems. Yeah, we're in trouble with biodiversity. We're in trouble with freshwater systems. But I feel like this all just kind of increases, like we're not just talking about cheap energy here. We're talking about an existential threat that we need to deal with right now. And I feel like that can be helpful to remember, even for me from time to time, when all I want to do is read romanticises, And I think, we talk a lot about the framework of climate justice, which I think is quite important. In traditional journalism, as in other forms, climate change was sometimes segmented in as like, this is in the environmental section or the science section, when in fact, climate justice is the idea that, climate, and as folks here know, I don't want to get lectury as a professor, but it's wrapped up in politics and economics and the idea that people in the global South, often people of color, often women, often Indigenous people who are least responsible for the problem are bearing the worst of impacts of climate change, and therefore we need to hold big emitters responsible. We have some real villains if anybody wants to cast them in our movies that we can deal with. And I also think stories that really center people who have been most affected actually give me hope. And so I know this sounds weird. Have you guys read Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler?
No.
It's super depressing. Okay,
Great. Okay.
I mean, it's wonderful though. It's about a 15-year-old girl, African-American girl growing up in a fictional future of 2023. Octavia Butler, though, is, she's an Afrofuturist thinker. And Lauren, I don't want to have any spoilers for people who haven't read it, but really, it's the darkest possible apocalypse you can imagine. And this is to your earlier question, Shira, but we have people coming together, working together, and being willing to imagine a new future together. And so I think that, and that I see that as a climate justice story, and that does give me hope, actually. So those are some of the things I bring.
So I think it's sort of breaking down that silo between climate as like a science section,
Yes.
and then, oh, people are, drowning in Katrina, and that's like a human interest story. And it's like, no, that's
Exactly.
kind of
And
combining them is more effective.
exactly. And this idea that every story is a climate story, and to really think about climate, like I analogized it to love earlier, but it's like gravity. It's just the reality of the world that we're living in. I think if that makes sense.
And I guess actually that made me, when you were talking earlier, Jesse, I had this question of things that are, when you're saying it's site specific when you do these workshops. So in New York, in a place where you can feel disconnected from nature, for example, like so what would be something that would be specific to New York City when you're thinking about that?
Well, New York was interesting in the sense it was our inaugural workshop. And so there was a bit of sort of roll your sleeves up and see what happens. And as I said, everything's been very organic. It just happened, the date of our workshop happened to correspond to the day of action. And so we were able to fold that discussion very, very seamlessly into our conversation about climate. So it became climate storytelling and democracy and resistance. Just was a natural with natural bedfellows because of how that weekend transpired. When we went to Los Angeles, we obviously talked about the fires that happened earlier in that year, but also how does that then impact insurance? How does that impact who sort of a culture of care amongst community members? And we talked about the drought and water shortage, and so we're able to think specifically about what are the micro aspects of the stories that would be specific to that audience. And when we were in LA, we actively we brought a journalist from the LA Times, a climate journalist, to talk about some of the concerns that she was addressing in her work. It really does, we've been in conversation, for example, with some organizers in Tulsa, and to think about what are the specific areas of concern in Tulsa, where you have the indigenous and a petroculture kind of really, really tightly interwoven with a very fractious racial history. As also with the insurgence of green energy. So we really think specifically about what's happening within the local area and what are the concerns of the local stakeholders, and how can we shape our workshops so that they are folding in those conversations in a way that is going to be relevant to the storytellers who come to those workshops.
And then I guess before we switch away from this, are there, for folks who want to talk about this, not necessarily in a screenplay or in this context, are there ways that you could distill just how to be a more effective climate storyteller in your own life? I mean, we all have the experience of, I don't know, the colleague who doesn't believe it, or the holiday, which, you have the uncle, or I don't, luckily I don't have that, but I know it's definitely a theme in America. Just the conversations you have, how to be a more persuasive, less pedantic, and engaging climate storyteller in your day-to-day life.
Yeah, I mean, part of it, honestly, is listening.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
In terms of this is something that Lydia does some really interesting work in terms of thinking about audience hinging And I won't try to I'll let Lydia speak to that in a moment. But really, part of it is thinking about who you're talking to and how can you, if you're not going to necessarily change them wholesale into another way of thinking, but there's always points of commonality. And it's finding out what are those points of adjacency, and how do you leverage those in that conversation? So listening and and honoring another person's point of view so that you actually can, so you're not just lecturing, you're actually taking on board what they're saying and trying to talk with them from a position that matters to them. I'm fortunate in that I live in a very, very politically mixed neighborhood here in northern Manhattan. And so I'm talking to Trump supporters, and I did not vote for Trump, but I'm talking to them. They're my neighbors. And so it ends up being a really interesting conversation. We can have a non-polarized civil conversation and we find points of commonality. And I think that that becomes an interesting way to move forward as a community, sort of neighbor to neighbor, person to person. And I'll say just really quickly as well, we have had folks come to our workshops who aren't screenwriters, but they're activists or they're community organizers or they work for nonprofits, and they're trying to understand how to use storytelling techniques to apply to their own work so that they can be more persuasive in their work. But Lydia, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the audience.
I do. I just want to say that's like the most positive and hopeful thing I've heard today, picturing you in northern Manhattan having civil conversations with Trump supporters about climate is like really heartening. Okay, Lydia, I know what should we be thinking about audience and how is that something that's often omitted from crafting stories?
Yeah. Well, I was also going to just, we're stakeholders in a research project that I initiated at Columbia Climate School with a meteorologist. And he was very interested in the work that we've been doing. And in his work, he's just eternally frustrated that people are not really connecting to a perception of risk. And then his job becomes more about cleaning up disasters and catastrophes rather than preparedness. And so we are doing a research project in partnership with him. And it is really looking at this gap that exists between traditional science comms, the top-down data-driven ways that climate science gets communicated, which I think is what people maybe feel a little bit allergic to. Mm-hmm. And the way people actually make decisions, which is emotionally, it's tapping into the cognitive processes of the brain. It's based on your values, belief systems, metaphors, symbols, all things that are storytelling techniques. And so we're looking at how do we bridge this gap by using these things in our storytelling. And one of the things that is really important, and I've realized this for a long time, even going back to looking at systemic change in Hollywood around gender equality and diversity and equity and inclusion, is that we have to look at audience. And we're living in a time now where the audience is participatory, and we're really missing something if we're not thinking expansively about our audience as we're creating content. And this is also something that I think speaks the language of studios, because the more expansive your audience is, the more streaming subscriptions and tickets that people are buying, and that's really an incentive on that side. But I think that in the course of my career as a producer, a lot of the marketing demographics were always centered around quads of age and gender and geographic location, whereas in climate, a very, very useful framework, and we've been using it in our workshops, and people really respond to it, is a values-based segmentation. And there's a group called the Harmony Labs that has created research around new climate audiences. And they've taken this Shalom Schwartz universal theory of human values and created a different kind of quad, which is based on surveying online media and looking at the places where people hang out in media. And it's very, very interesting. We go into it in depth in our workshops, but it's public and it's online. So anybody could go to it and check it out yourselves. But you will see that there are the traditional core audiences that you might be thinking about. But if you're looking at the quad, next to your core, there's going to be two other quads, which we call are your hinge audiences. They're not people you might have been thinking about for your story. But if you actually go in and do that research and see what their where they are with their values, that there are things that you have in common with concerns around climate. And so it's this way of expanding your audience as you're telling your story. I think for creatives, one of the things that we've seen is even going into that kind of gold mine of research about where people hang out in media really gives you great character details to bring if you choose, or amplify or create into your ensemble. And that's another reason why I think television is very successful for climate stories, because you do have ensemble storytelling where you have a myriad of different characters that can be a part of these stories.
And then can you use that as a pitch to help overcome skepticism or kind of cold feet that it's too political, to say, hey, here's this whole market segment you're missing of people who care that the world's on fire? Like, I mean, is that actually have an economic capitalist
Absolutely,
motivator?
absolutely, because those are the demographics that start to emerge. I mean, you've got faith-based, audiences that are very interested about the Earth and the planet, and you can just go down the line. You find all of these. That's why they call it new climate audiences. They're not the ones that we're thinking about, because they're thinking about the ones that
Right.
would be sort of power to the people. But this is we see that as the climate crisis accelerates, and we know that global warming is continuing to rise, that the concern is also rising. And it was even today, in the New York Times, it was interesting to see that with oil prices rising, with this, that a lot of people are looking at renewable energy, saying maybe
Right.
this isn't such a bad idea after all. It's not going to get caught up in all these other things that are happening with oil globally. So I think that there's the paying attention to this idea of values-based storytelling, and a lot of people have been sort of putting some notes in the comments in the chat about what is a successful climate story. But I think that this is where we see ourselves, and this is where we see possibility. And I think when we look at stories, we want to be inspired and sort of think about things in new and different ways. So this transition that we sort of got into very early in the conversation about values going in a direction that maybe many of us here are not so happy about, I think we can turn that around if we're focused on it and really thinking about beyond just our core audience to, a wider berth who will care about the same things that we care about.
And then do you see, I guess, a nexus with, if we're thinking about systems, about like systems change? I mean, how does this connect to, we were talking this a little bit, like political actors or places like cities, and how they can sort of respond or be part of those narratives if we feel like maybe there's certain levels of government or corporate structures that aren't accessible, maybe are not going to be amenable to shifting. Is there a way in which you're thinking about other nodes of
Well, I
forward?
think what we're seeing, and particularly working with UN climate change, is that we're not, the idea of multilateral diplomacy has not been working, right? And this concept of mini-lateralism, which is really looking for the impact of work that can happen with subnational governments. So we're talking about states and cities, is really powerful. And with New York City, it's I'll just full disclosure, I am on the arts and culture transition team, which is continuing our work this spring. It's interesting to hear the Mamdani transition team talk about cultural infrastructure, and because I think about cultural infrastructure a lot in the context of climate, I'm very excited to sort of see how an office like the one that is hosting this webinar, the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment, which, is big. It has you have over 100 employees in this division, right? And how can this division work with, our chief climate officer, Louise Young, who is overseeing the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice? I think that we're seeing justice as a large conversation in the city of New York right now. And I think it'll be very, very interesting for us all to, find the ways that we can get involved in taking our stories to policy, or thinking about how we take stories to policy.
I love that. I think this is a good time. I like to talk about things we're hopeful for. But before I get there, I think I just want to thank you guys so much, because I found this conversation to be, my wheels were turning as we were talking, and it felt a little bit, before we came on screen to the audience, we were talking about college, and it was like, oh, these are some of the ideas that I miss from when your whole job is to learn stuff, and how it's helpful for all of us to kind of keep up our reading and not have it just be headlines that make you sort of want to take a bath with the toaster, but rather like, frameworks and different ways to approach our work that can be really informative and kind of give you an aha moment when you're sort of head down thinking about it in one particular way. So I love that what you guys are doing is so interdisciplinary and is engaging academic institutions and young people and now us. So I just want to thank you guys. You're doing amazing work. And then I like to end these discussions with just saying one thing we're kind of hopeful about, since, as Abby pointed out in the discussion, there's a lot to not be hopeful about. I'm just kidding. So I don't know, Abby, you want to kick it off? Something you're hopeful about?
Sure. I mean, I don't know. I'm a teacher. I'm a professor, and I feel like sometimes in the media we can have a narrative of Gen Z as disengaged and just scrolling on their social media phones and being fragmented attention. But I actually work with a lot of engaged students, and one of them is a student of mine, a former student, Safin, who was in my climate fiction class, in which he came to understand himself and his family as climate refugees. He went on to work for Con Edison to safeguard smart grid technologies, and now he's going to get his Master of Science in Sustainability Management from Columbia. And I'm just looking forward to what Gen Z is going to do about this whole world.
Okay, Jesse, what are you?
Goodness, no pressure. To the Gen Z. Yeah, I have two kids. My children are Gen Z, and they kind of like, you're putting a lot of weight on us,
Yeah. We have to.
So, I mean, I can say really specifically in terms of some of the things that we as a trio are doing. It's great working with these two people, these two powerhouses. It's been a real pleasure. And so we have a few things coming down the pike for us collectively in terms of our, we're going to be part of the Changing Climate, Changing Lives Film Festival in Bangkok in June. That was by invitation. We have a storytelling toolkit coming out from the Producers Guild at the end of March. We've got a workshop queued up with ANEW, which is a group, a social activist group based in the West Village. And we're partnering with Climate Film Festival for that. So some of the things that we're doing as an entity, I'm very excited about, just because, like I said, it continues to expand us as well in terms of the way we think about these. And if I can make another little shout out to Inwood. So Inwood is my neighborhood up in northern Manhattan, where I am so dearly in love with and have been here for over 20 years. And I live right on the park, 200 acres of woods right outside my door. And this is the time in which I look forward to watching spring come. Specifically, it's like next will be the forsythia, and then we've got the daffodils, and we've got the tulips, and there's just this nice sort of sequence of flowering growth that happens. And in the 20 years that I've lived here, I've learned to recognize the patterns of that. And then baseball season comes. It's Inwood, and there's always kids playing baseball in the park. So I'm looking forward to some of those markers of seasonal growth that I've come to recognize from being up here in Inwood for as long as I have.
Love that. Lydia.
Yeah, I'm with Jonathan Unger. I'm really excited about seeing Hoppers, which apparently is a great Pixar environmental climate systems thinking movie starring beavers. I'm excited about that. I really do get a lot of energy out of teaching. I think that Jesse and Abby and I all do because we're dealing, we deal with undergraduate and graduate level students, and these are people who are focusing and coming to the classes because they're really committed to learning something and to take something away. And when we really get into the craft of storytelling, we're really getting into drilling into what matters to us. Where do we find meaning, and what really is our purpose, and what's our vision, and what's our contribution. And I think that the storytelling, when we bring all of these different sort of brains together, whether it's bringing PGA and DGA and WGA, or whether it's bringing, at Columbia, bringing policy students, architecture students, climate students, and filmmakers, you really do see transformation happen. You see it happen in the creative process. So I think for us, and I think probably for this group here today, creativity is really the thing that we need that will save us, and it may save more than us, especially if we come together and find that way to make that transformation happen. Yeah.
I guess for me, so maybe some people know, some people don't, but the majority of my time at the mayor's office is actually focused on supporting our music industry portfolio, which I drive. And to the mini lateralism, in 2024, this delegation came from Liverpool, and I shared with them about this thing I created called New York Music Month, which is the city's official music festival, which is going into its ninth year. It's all June. It's grown kind of year over year into this, what I would call like placemaking. It's this place where people kind of come together. You don't have to spend money. And I've seen it really build ties across the music industry here and more community. And so we had discussed it and they thought it was cool. And now in May, they're doing Liverpool Music Month. And they've kind of acknowledged that it's a connection to New York. And so I was looking forward to that. It's making me happy to feel like you could connect on this really human level. The delegation came, I met with them, and then one of the members and I met in Bryant Park and ended up just kind of talking for 2 hours about our lives and all these different things, as well as Music Month. And so it feels like, oh, these things can generate not just from the wonky data, but really from this human connection. And then to your thing, Jesse, I have these mourning doves that live on my air conditioner, which I may or may not take out during the winter because I live in New York. And then every year I'm like worried they're not going to come back, but they just came back. And it
Oh,
made me really happy. It's probably not healthy that they live on my air conditioning unit, but I still really love seeing them.
Yeah.
So that's making me hopeful. And then I guess before we go, I wanted to make sure that I asked you guys about upcoming events because I know we had talked about that. And if there's anything you want to flag for the wonderful people who have joined us, who I'm also very thankful for, and it makes me hopeful that people tune into this and then watch it after we post it. Any kind of updates for them?
Hmm. Well, I'll just second, Jesse, what you said. We were commissioned to write a climate storytelling section of this sustainable storytelling part of an overall sustainable production toolkit that PGA is doing, the Producers Guild of America. And it is, we're not exactly sure of the date, but it is dropping soon. And it'll have a section on clean energy, a section on waste and materials, and our section on storytelling, where it's a little bit, you got the highlights today. It gives you a little more opportunities to make some deeper dives into some of the things that we talked about. In what we do, I think with culture and climate, they're both elements of zeitgeist, right? Because culture's always changing, climate's always changing. We're always trying to find that intersection where they cross, and then what do we glean in terms of our action items from there? So look forward to that. And the other thing with the Climate Film Festival, we're really looking to and sort of investigate what's happening in around climate justice and the stories that are being told. We're in New York City. We're all New Yorkers, so we will focus it here. But I would say that climate justice is still a growing sort of area and field that is starting to reflect the complexity of the issues, and it's very people centered. And so it gives me a lot of hope as we think about the different things and plans that are happening across our city around climate and mitigation and adaptation.
All right. Well, thank you everyone who tuned in, and thank you to our amazing speakers. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you guys at the next NYC Film Green office hours.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.